The whole boardroom went quiet the moment Conrad Ellery walked through the door, not because he was loud, not because he made any kind of entrance. He walked in the way a man walks into a hardware store on a Saturday morning, unhurried, unassuming, carrying a briefcase that had seen better decades. His suit was gray. Not charcoal, not slate, just gray. The kind of gray that had been washed too many times and had quietly surrendered any ambition it once had. His shoes were clean but old, the leather creased at the toe in the particular way that comes from years of actual use rather than occasional wear. He was 61 years old and he looked it. Silver at the temples, deep lines around the eyes, the kind of face that had spent real time outdoors in real Canadian winters. He nodded at the receptionist near the door. She didn't nod back. She was already looking past him. The room belonged to Aldercroft Capital Group, and on the 32nd floor of a glass tower in downtown Toronto, it had been designed to make a specific kind of impression. The table was black and long enough to seat 14. The chairs were Italian. The view through the floor-to-ceiling windows took in the whole of the financial district, and on clear days, a thin gray line of Lake Ontario at the edge of everything. The kind of room that was meant to remind visitors of their own relative smallness. Conrad Ellery set his briefcase down on the table, pulled out a chair near the middle, and sat. He was early. The meeting wasn't for another 8 minutes. Aldercroft Capital Group had been, 3 years ago, one of the most admired mid-size investment firms in the country. It had been built on the back of a single founding principle, that institutional discipline and personal relationships were not mutually exclusive, and for a long time, that principle had served it well. But the market had shifted, the founding partners had aged out or moved on, and the woman who now sat in the executive chair on the 32nd floor had inherited a company running on momentum and reputation alone, both of which were beginning to thin. Her name was Diane Ashford. She was 44 years old. She had come up through mergers and acquisitions at 2 Bay Street firms before a board that was tired, and risk-averse had decided that what Aldercroft needed was someone who looked like the future. Diane Ashford looked like the future. She dressed like it, spoke like it, ran meetings like it. She had a gift for identifying the precise thing a room wanted to hear and delivering it with the conviction of someone who had always believed it. In the 3 years since she'd taken the position, she had made 2 successful acquisitions and one that was quietly unraveling. The quarterly numbers were softer than anyone was saying out loud. She needed this deal. The deal in question was a capital injection, $200 million, structured as a minority stake with a 10-year horizon, from a private investment office called Meridian Cedar Holdings. Meridian Cedar was not a name most people in the industry would have recognized. It had no website beyond a single landing page with a mailing address in Halifax and a phone number that, when called, reached a polite woman named Janet who would take a message. It did not attend conferences. It did not issue press releases. What it had was a portfolio that, if assembled and evaluated soberly, represented one of the most quietly successful long-term investment records in the country. The kind of record that didn't make headlines because the people behind it didn't want headlines. Conrad Ellery was those people. He had started Meridian Cedar Holdings in 1991 with $200,000, a rented desk in a shared office in Halifax, and a philosophy about patience that most people in finance had spent their careers trying to argue against. He had made his first significant return in 1997. He had made his second in 2003. He had never lost a decade. He was not famous. He was not on any list. He did not own a boat or a second house in the country or a table at any restaurant worth knowing about. He had one house in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia, which he'd bought in 1999 for a price that would make current homeowners weep, and which he had not renovated because it suited him fine as it was. He drove a 2009 Subaru Outback with a crack in the rear bumper from a parking lot in Moncton that he'd never gotten around to fixing. He had one daughter, Evelyn, who taught elementary school in Fredericton and called him every Sunday. He had no interest in being known. What he had an interest in, at this particular moment in late October, was whether Aldercroft Capital Group was worth $200 million of his trust. The team filed in at 3 minutes to the hour. Diane Ashford came in last, the way people do when they want the room to feel their arrival. She was in a navy suit, precisely cut, with reading glasses pushed up into dark hair that had been blown out that morning. She had the look of someone who had reviewed the agenda twice on the elevator and was now performing the act of not having reviewed it. Her executive assistant, a young man named Philip, who walked slightly behind her and to the left, as though he had calibrated the exact geometry of deference, carried a folder and a tablet. She did not look at the man already seated at the table. Not immediately. There were 4 other people with her: the CFO, the head of strategic partnerships, a senior analyst whose name Conrad would not learn until later, and a junior associate who appeared to be there to operate the presentation screen. They arranged themselves along one side of the table with the practiced ease of people who did this often. Then Diane Ashford looked at Conrad Ellery. The pause was short. A second, maybe 2. But Conrad noticed it, the way a man who has spent 30 years reading people in rooms notices things. It was the pause of recalibration. She had walked in expecting someone, a certain kind of someone, and the man in the gray suit with the old briefcase was performing an unexpected subtraction from that expectation. She walked toward him with her hand extended, and Conrad rose and reached for it. She withdrew it. It was not dramatic. It was almost administrative. She turned the motion into a gesture toward the chair across from him, as though she'd never intended a handshake at all. "Mr. Ellery," she said, and the flatness in her voice carried the specific kind of courtesy that is indistinguishable from dismissal. "I'm Diane Ashford." She sat without waiting for him to respond. "I understand you've had a look at our prospectus." Conrad Ellery sat back down. He did not say anything for a moment. He looked at the table, then at the window, then at her. His expression did not change. He had the face of a man who had decided some decades ago that most things were not worth reacting to and had since made peace with that decision. "I have," he said. The CFO, whose name was Raymond Park, opened a laptop. The junior associate dimmed the lights and put up the first slide. The presentation began. It was a good presentation, technically speaking. Clean data, clear structure. A narrative arc that moved from challenge to opportunity with the confidence of people who had rehearsed the pivot. Raymond walked them through the capital requirements. The head of strategic partnerships, a woman named Gwen Ossie, outlined the 3-year expansion plan with maps and projections that were optimistic without being obviously implausible. Conrad Ellery watched all of it. He asked 2 questions in 40 minutes. Both were specific. Both landed in the room like stones dropped into still water. The first was directed at Raymond. "Your debt-to-equity ratio has moved 14 points in 26 months. Is that structural or situational?" Raymond blinked. "I'd characterize it as transitional," he said, after a beat that lasted slightly too long. "I see," said Conrad. The second was directed at Gwen. "The Halifax corridor expansion in your Phase 2. That's predicated on regulatory approval that hasn't been granted yet. What's your contingency if the timeline extends past Q3? Gwen looked at Diane. Diane did not look at Gwen. "We have flexibility built into the model," Diane said, without specifying what that flexibility was or where in the model it lived. "I see," said Conrad again, in exactly the same tone. He wrote something in the small notebook he had produced from his jacket pocket at the start of the meeting. No one could see what he wrote. He capped the pen and set it down. When the lights came back up and the screen went dark, Diane Ashford leaned forward with the particular posture of a woman who has made up her mind about the outcome of a conversation and is now simply managing its arrival. "We're very excited about what a partnership with Meridian Cedar could mean for Aldercroft," she said. "We think the alignment is strong and the timing is right." She paused. "That said, I want to be direct with you. We're speaking with 2 other capital groups this month, and we'll be making a decision by the end of November. We'd love for you to be part of this, but we need to know that Meridian Cedar is prepared to move with the kind of urgency this moment requires." Conrad looked at her. "How old is this building?" he said. A silence. "I'm sorry," said Diane. "This building, the tower." He tilted his head slightly toward the window. "Do you know when it was built?" Raymond cleared his throat. "I think 1989 maybe, or early 90s, 1988, said Conrad. "It was finished in 1988. The company that built it went bankrupt in 1993. The building outlasted the company by 30 years. He picked up his notebook. "Urgency," he said, almost to himself, "is usually someone else's problem, dressed up as your opportunity." He closed the notebook. "I'll be in touch, Ms. Ashford." He stood. He picked up his briefcase. He buttoned the top button of his gray jacket. And Diane Ashford, who had built a career on reading rooms and closing conversations, found herself watching a 61-year-old man in a worn suit walk to the door of her boardroom and leave without looking back. And she had the strange and uncomfortable sensation that she had just failed a test she hadn't known she was taking. She didn't think about it much that evening. She told Philip to send the standard follow-up letter, the one that conveyed continued interest without conceding leverage. She had dinner with 2 board members at a restaurant on King Street and talked about Q4 with the measured optimism she had learned to perform without effort. She went home at 9:30, read for 20 minutes, and slept. She thought about it more on Friday when Raymond stopped by her office to say that he'd done a bit more research on Meridian Cedar Holdings and wanted to share a few things he'd found. She thought about it considerably more after Raymond finished sharing. Meridian Cedar Holdings, in its 33 years of quiet operation, had returned an average of 11.4% annually to its investors net of fees. It had done this through 2 recessions, a financial crisis, a pandemic, and a period of inflation that had carved through most traditional portfolios like a blade through paper. It had never made a public statement. It had never been the subject of a profile in any business publication, in part because it had never agreed to participate in one. Its assets under management were in the range of $4 billion. Conrad Ellery had built all of that from a desk in Halifax and a philosophy about patience, and he had done it without anyone in this tower knowing his name. Raymond set the folder on her desk and stepped back. The 2 companies he's invested in over the past 5 years, he said carefully, both saw a 40+% increase in valuation within 36 months. Diane Ashford looked at the folder. She looked at the window. She looked at the crack in the ceiling tile above Raymond's head that the facilities team had been promising to fix for 2 years. "Why didn't we know this before the meeting?" she said. Raymond said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. She called the number on Monday. Janet answered, polite as ever, and took a message. Conrad called back on Wednesday afternoon from what sounded like the interior of a car. The connection was clear. His voice was the same as it had been in the boardroom. Unhurried, quiet, containing nothing it didn't need to contain. "Mrs. Ashford," he said. "I got your message, Mr. Ellery." She had prepared for this call the way she prepared for everything, thoroughly, specifically, with a clear objective. "I wanted to follow up on our meeting last week. I felt we may not have given you the full picture of what Aldercroft is building, and I'd welcome the opportunity to sit down again." There was a pause. "I had a full picture," Conrad said, a shorter pause this time on her end. "Of course, I only meant Ms. Ashford." His voice was not unkind. It was something else, settled, maybe. The voice of a man who had stopped trying to be heard by people who weren't listening and had consequently become very good at it. "I've been doing this for 30 years. I've sat in rooms very much like yours many times. I can usually tell in the first 10 minutes whether a company's leadership understands the difference between a good story and a good business." Another pause. "Last week I wasn't certain which one I was looking at, and now," she said, before she could stop herself. "Now I'm uncertain in a different way," he said. "That's progress of a kind, I suppose." She waited. "I'll be in Halifax until the 2nd week of November. If you want to have a real conversation, not a presentation, a conversation, you're welcome to come here. My office is not impressive, but it's where I work." He gave her the address. It was on a street she had never heard of. She flew to Halifax on a Tuesday. Philip had offered to come. She told him she was fine. The address turned out to be a 3-story building on a side street near the waterfront, the kind of building that had been a cannery or a warehouse in a previous life, and had since been divided into offices that smelled faintly of salt air and old wood. There was no sign for Meridian Cedar Holdings on the directory. There was no directory. There was a staircase and a handwritten number 3 on a door on the 2nd floor, and when she knocked, a woman she assumed was Janet opened it and brought her into a room with 2 chairs, a desk covered in papers, and a window that looked out onto a parking lot, and beyond that, a slice of the harbor. Conrad Ellery was standing at the window when she came in. He turned and nodded. He was wearing a flannel shirt. They talked for 3 hours, not about projections, not about timelines or synergies or strategic alignment or any of the other vocabulary that her industry had developed to make uncertainty sound like a plan. They talked about what Aldercroft had actually been, what it was now, and what it might honestly become. They talked about the founding partners and what they had understood about long-term relationships that the current model was losing. Conrad asked her about the acquisition that was quietly unraveling. She told him the truth about it. She wasn't sure, afterward, why she had. She suspected it was because he had asked the question in a way that made lying feel like more effort than it was worth. At one point, he got up and made tea on a small electric kettle on a shelf near the door. He brought her a mug without asking how she took it, and it was plain, and she drank it plain, and it was fine. When she stood to leave at the end of the afternoon, he walked her to the door of the office. "I owe you an apology," she said. She'd been carrying the sentence for most of the previous hour. He looked at her. "Last week," she said, "when you came in, I made an assumption about who you were, before you'd said anything." She paused. That was unprofessional, and it was wrong. Conrad was quiet for a moment. He looked at the wall beside her head, not past her, just slightly to the side, the way people do when they're considering something carefully. "Everybody makes assumptions," he said finally. "The question is what you do once you've noticed you've made one." He picked up his jacket from the back of the door. "You noticed," he said. "That's not nothing." She didn't know what to say to that. So she said goodbye, and he said goodbye, and she walked down the stairs and out into the Halifax afternoon, where the wind off the harbor hit her square in the face and smelled like something she couldn't name. Back in Toronto, the days moved in their accustomed way. The board meeting in November covered the Q3 numbers with the particular atmosphere of a room full of adults, pretending that what they were looking at was a speed bump rather than a wall. The second capital group they'd been speaking with, a fund out of Vancouver, pulled back citing portfolio reallocation priorities, which was the industry phrase for "we've decided the risk isn't worth it." The unraveling acquisition unraveled further. Raymond started sending Diane daily updates on the cash position that she read and set face down on her desk. She did not hear from Conrad Ellery. She did not reach out. She had promised herself she would not reach out. She had said what she came to Halifax to say, and whatever came next was his decision to make on his timeline. Then, on the last Thursday in November, Janet called. Not Conrad. Janet, she said that Mr. Ellery would like to schedule a call for Friday morning if Miss Ashford was available. Miss Ashford was available. The call lasted 11 minutes. Conrad spoke for most of it. He said that he had spent the better part of October and November reviewing everything he'd found about Aldercroft. Not just the prospectus, but the case history of every significant decision the company had made over the past decade. Its client retention rates, the turnover in its mid-level management, the published commentary of its founding partners, and the trajectory of the 3 senior analysts who had left in the past 18 months, and what they had said in various forums about why. He said he'd also had a conversation with a former client of Aldercroft's, who had subsequently become a client of his. He did not name the client. He said that what he had found was a company with a genuinely good core, a set of client relationships and institutional knowledge that was worth considerably more than the current numbers suggested, wrapped around a leadership model that had lost its original purpose and was now running largely on presentation. He said this without any particular heat, the way he might describe weather conditions or road construction. Factually, without implied judgment about whether it was anyone's fault. And then he said that he was prepared to proceed with the investment. Full terms as originally discussed. $200 million, minority stake, 10-year horizon, on 2 conditions. The first, a quarterly operating review in which he or a representative from Meridian Cedar would have full access to internal management data, not just summary reporting. The second, Aldercroft's leadership team, starting with its CEO, would spend 1 week each year visiting companies in Meridian Cedar's portfolio. Not to consult, not to advise, not to be observed. To observe, to see how different kinds of leadership made different kinds of decisions over time. "These aren't punitive," he said when he'd finished stating them. "They're just the conditions under which I've found that money tends to be used for what it's actually for." Diane Ashford was quiet for a moment. "I accept both conditions," she said. "Good," said Conrad. "Have Janet get in touch with Philip to start on the paperwork." A pause. "How's the harbor?" she said without planning to. There was a brief silence, and then she was almost certain of it, a sound that might have been a quiet laugh. "Gray," he said, "but clear. The papers were signed before Christmas." "Raymond." who had spent the last 2 months running projections that tried to account for every outcome except the one that had materialized, stared at the wire transfer confirmation for a long moment before he said anything. What he finally said was, "How?" Diane didn't answer immediately. She was looking at the window. Outside, the financial district was doing what it always did in December, the same glass and steel, the same light caught in the same angles, but something in the way she was looking at it had shifted. "We stopped performing," she said, "eventually." Raymond frowned. That's all it took? She thought about a gray suit, a worn briefcase, tea made on a shelf kettle in an office above a Halifax parking lot, a question about a building that had outlasted the company that built it. Not all, she said. But it was the part that mattered, the week she spent in Meridian Cedar's portfolio that March was not what she expected. She had expected polish. She had not found it. What she found were companies run by people who had been making small, unglamorous decisions for long periods of time, and had, as a result, built things that worked. A manufacturer in Winnipeg that had not missed a client delivery in 11 years. A logistics company in St. John that had turned down 3 acquisition offers in the past decade because the numbers had been right and the relationships hadn't been. A property development firm in Charlottetown whose founder still drove himself to site visits every Tuesday in a truck that was older than some of his junior employees. Conrad joined her for one afternoon at the St. John Company. He didn't introduce himself to anyone by name. He shook hands with the warehouse crew. He asked the operations manager about a loading process she'd changed in August. He listened to the full answer, which took 6 minutes. In the car afterward, Diane asked him how many of his portfolio companies he visited each year. "All of them," he said. "Every year? Every year." She looked out the window at the New Brunswick highway moving past. Spruce trees and gray sky and the particular late winter quality of Canadian light that is neither beautiful nor harsh but simply honest. "You don't advertise that," she said. "No," he said. "Why not?" He drove for a moment without answering. The crack in the rear bumper caught a rattle from the road and then released it. "Because the point of doing it," he said, "isn't to be known for doing it." She thought about that sentence many times in the year that followed. She thought about it when the Q2 numbers came in better than any projection Raymond had run. She thought about it when they retained a client they would have lost 6 months earlier, because someone on her team had finally made the call that needed making, rather than the call that looked good in a report. She thought about it when the unraveling acquisition was restructured in a way that recovered 60% of what had seemed unrecoverable, because she had sat across from the other party and said the true thing instead of the strategic thing, and the other party, surprised by this, had responded in kind. She thought about it sitting in the boardroom on the 32nd floor on a Tuesday in October, looking at the same Italian chairs and the same view of the city, and the thin gray line of the lake at the edge of everything. She thought about a man in a gray suit walking through that door a year ago, and the way she had looked past him, and the specific weight of having done that. She did not think she would ever stop thinking about it. What she had learned, or perhaps relearned, since she suspected she had known it once and misplaced it somewhere along the way, was not a strategy and not a framework, and not anything she could have put on a slide and presented to a room. It was something quieter and more durable than any of that. It was the understanding that how you treated a person in the first 10 seconds of knowing them was a kind of information about you, not them, and that the world was full of people who would never tell you they had received it. Conrad Ellery had received it. He had not told her. He had simply quietly allowed it to be part of what he knew. And then, because he was the kind of person he was, he had decided that what he already knew was not the whole story. That was the part she carried with her, not the money. Not the paperwork, not the wire transfer or the quarterly reviews or even the week in St. John with the warehouse crew, and the operations manager and her loading process. Just that. The fact that someone had decided, without being asked, that she was worth a second look. She had spent the year since trying to deserve it.